This week on B.Hooked Crochet, I'm going to walk you through the entire process of making the Bearfeet slippers, a brand new pattern that's available from Yarnspirations.com. Now you can download your pattern at Yarnspirations.com. You can just search for Bearfeet slippers, or you can get to it from the link in the description below. Well, I'm your host, Brittany, and if you're ready, let's dive into this brand new project. Before tackling a pattern that has multiple sizes available within the written instructions, it's so important to take just a quick second to organize yourself, figure out what size you're going to make, and learn how that's going to be shown in the written instructions. So the first thing I want you to do is focus your attention here on the different sizes and choose the size that you'll be working with. For the demonstration, I'll be working on the ladies size 7 and 8. And I'm just taking note of this color right here as it is on my computer screen. Well, a lot of people will print the pattern, and when they do that, of course, if they're in my shoes, I like to print in black and white, so I'm not going to see these color references anymore. That's important because when the sizes are given to you in the instructions, so down here within the text, it's color coded. But it also goes based on the size that you see here. So it is sequential. We're going to start off with this size here. That's going to be given first, which you see right here. And then it's going to go through the child 6 to 8. That'll be second. The ladies size 5 to 6. That'll be third, and so on. Well, nobody wants to go through that as they're working through the pattern. It's just so much easier if you can either highlight or circle the pattern, the size that you'll be working with. So after you print it, take the quick second to go through and circle the size that you're working on. And throughout the tutorial, you'll hear me refer to different points in the pattern that say, depending on the size you're working with, you may do this instead of what I'm doing here on the screen. Well, these little points that you see where the parentheses are, that is where you will find the differences based on the sizing. So in those cases, you'll just refer to those sections of the written instructions. So even though you have the tutorial here at your disposal, you'll still need to follow along with the pattern to finish the project from completion, unless you're just working on the exact same size as me. Okay, so now that you have all of that taken care of, let's dive into the tutorial. So no matter which size you're working on, we're going to start off with a slip knot. And your foundation chain will be dependent on your size. So I'm going to chain 7. You'll refer to your written instructions to get the exact number. And then we're ready to start on our first row. Normally, I like to work my stitches in the back bump of the chain. But for this starting method, I like to work just in one loop. Now that's technically not the correct way to go, but it makes it so much easier when we're going to work stitches down one side and then back up the other. So that's what we're doing here. We're starting with the toe. We're going to locate our second chain from the hook and single crochet there. That's the same no matter which size you're working on. And then we're going to single crochet into each of the next 4 stitches. Now that count is size dependent, so you'll also get that number from your written instructions. Now what that does is set you up so that your last chain is the next thing that you're going to work into. So in that last chain, you're going to make 3 single crochets, and that is no matter what size you're working on. And I'm sort of rotating my work as I work those 3 stitches because I want to work around and build upon the under part of the chain. So we're looking at our foundation from the underside now. I have my tail just sort of draped over here in the back. I like to work over that, but you really don't have to. You can weave it in later if you're more comfortable. What we need to do is find the next stitch to work. So I can see my hole right here, which is that last chain. I'm not going to work in that anymore. I'm just going to focus my attention on the stitch right here. So you can sort of see that last little piece of the chain right there, and they sort of come together and leave a little hole. Well, that's where you're going to insert your hook. Now the same number of stitches that you made in between that first and last chain, that's going to be the same for you here. So I'm going to do that 4 times, and then we'll find the next little section. So find the little cross or the little X. So I have a loop there and a loop there, and where they come together, that's where I'll insert my hook to work the next stitch. And just repeat that. Find the loop and where they connect. And one final time. After you've completed that, what we're left with here is one final stitch. You can see that right here where I have those 2 pieces that come together, the hole is a little less noticeable. But we're going to work 2 single crochets into that space, and that is no matter what size you're working on. Now once you're finished with that, we're going to join with a slip stitch to our first single crochet, which is right here. So insert your hook under both loops of that stitch, yarn over, pull through, and pull through. Now that is going to finish off row 1. I like to give it a little tug to close up some of the gaps that you might see there from working your hook into the chain. Okay, so we're moving on now to round number 2. We're going to begin by chaining 1, and we're going to make a single crochet in the same stitch that we just placed our slip stitch. So that means we're not counting these chain 1s as a stitch. The next thing is to work across this row. Now that number of stitches is going to be dependent on your size. I'm going to work 1 single crochet into each of the next 5 stitches. For my size, the ladies 7 to 8. And now here's where all the sizing comes together. The next stitch, we're going to work 3 single crochets. So go ahead and work your first one, and then work your second one in the same stitch. But before you move on, you'll need to place a stitch marker in that middle stitch. So I'm using these locking stitch markers, which I find to be really helpful because they don't fall out. But if you don't have one of these, you can use a bobby pin or a scrap piece of yarn. And I'm going to make my final stitch in that same space. So I have 3 stitches in the same stitch. And now I'm going to work down the row again. So for the ladies size 7, you'll work 1 single crochet into each of the next 6. If you're working on a different size, you'll find that information on your pattern. And we're ready to increase again. So we're going to find that next stitch and we'll work 3 single crochets in the same stitch. And we're going to place a stitch marker on the middle stitch again. Now at this point, you should be at the end of the round if you've been counting everything correctly. And what you'll need to do is join with the slip stitch to the first stitch. And that's going to finish off round number 2. Now we're moving on to round number 3. We're going to start by chaining 1, and we'll single crochet in the same stitch as our slip stitch from that previous round. The reason we placed these stitch markers was to make our lives a lot easier. So then we no longer have to worry about counting. We're just going to make 1 single crochet in every stitch until we reach the stitch marker. Once you get to your stitch marker, it's important to realize that these are your increasing points. So every stitch that you come to when it has that stitch marker, it's going to be your point of increase. We're always going to increase with 3 single crochets, and we're going to replace that marker in the middle stitch. Okay, so let me just explain that a little more. We'll make our first of 3, our second of 3 stitches, replace the stitch marker, then work the last stitch of our increase. And then we're going to make 1 single crochet into every stitch until we get to the next stitch marker. When you get to that stitch marker, we're going to treat it the same way. We'll increase there, so we want to make 3 single crochets in that stitch, and we'll be sure to replace the marker on that middle stitch. After we've worked that increase, we have 1 stitch remaining in this round. So every time we finish off a round here, we're going to join with the slip stitch to our first stitch. One of the things that's really going to help you determine how many stitches you have at the very end, because sometimes it can be difficult to see and to count, is to look at the written instructions. It will tell you the number of stitches that you'll have for the end of this round. So for the ladies size 7 to 8, we'll have a total of 22 stitches. I've confirmed that, so I know we're good to go. We're coming up on a repeated section here, and you'll see that in your written instructions. We are supposed to repeat round 3 a certain number of times, and that number of times is, of course, dependent on your size. I'm going to work this a total of 4 more times. You're going to follow whatever your instructions tell you for the size you're making. And a couple of things that I'll point out is that we're always going to start the same, so chain 1, single crochet in the same stitch. You're going to single crochet to your marker, and then you're going to increase in the same stitch as your marker with 3 single crochets, so just like we covered before. Then you're going to single crochet to your next marker, place your increase there, and then you're going to make a single crochet into each stitch until you get to the end of the round. So that's your repeat. I'm going to repeat that 4 more times, and we'll come back and talk about what to do next. Once you've finished your repeated section, no matter which size you're working on, your slipper should now look something like this. We have a very obvious toe shape, and we're ready to move on to another repeated section. But before we do that, we are completely finished with the increases for the toe. So we can remove these 2 stitch markers, but we don't want to get rid of them completely. We're going to use one of them to remind us where our last round of increasing happened, and that'll sort of make sense in a little bit when I talk about the next section. But for now, all you need to do is find any stitch, doesn't really matter, and place your stitch marker just under one of the loops of the stitch. That way it's just going to hang there and be on top and just mark our place where we are now. Now we will have to work around that, so if you're a little bit uncomfortable doing that, you might have to remove it and then replace it back. We'll work through that next. So the next round, we're going to begin in the same way. We'll chain 1 and single crochet in the same stitch as our slip stitch from that previous round. And all we need to do is make 1 single crochet into every stitch. And here I've come to the stitch marker, so I'm just going to release that really quick. Make my stitch there. And I still want to keep track of this round. So honestly, you can catch this on any part of the stitch that you want to, just as long as it is marking this row, this last row here of increase. That's the goal here. Okay, so for the rest of this round, all we're going to do is make 1 single crochet into every stitch. Now I'm going to do that real briefly here, and we'll meet back up at the end of this round, and I'll talk about how to finish things off and how we need to proceed with this repeated section. When you've made it to the end of your round, you're going to locate the first stitch from this round, and you'll join with a slip stitch there. To continue on with the pattern, what we need to do is repeat the last round that we just covered here, where we have 1 single crochet into every stitch. We're going to repeat that until our slipper measures a certain number. Now that number, as you can imagine, is dependent on the size you're creating. So for me, for the ladies size 7 to 8, that target number is 6.5 inches. And your stitch marker that you placed here, that's your starting point. We're not going to measure from the toe down here where we started. We're going to measure from here up, needs to be that amount specified in the written instructions. Once you come back from that, we're going to start working on the next section of the pattern. So we'll talk about that next. Go ahead and crochet your foot until the measurement that your written instructions tell you, and we'll talk about what to do next. Once you finish crocheting that last repeated section, your slipper now looks something like this. We have the toe and the foot completely worked, and we're ready to start talking about the heel and the upper part of the slipper. So we're completely finished now with the stitch markers, so I can remove this. And we're going to fasten off here. The way this thing comes together is pretty creative, actually. We work the foot just like we did before, and we're going to add the top section, and we're going to come back later to crochet the heel. So instead of moving on to the heel like you would think we will be doing, we're going to move on to the upper part of the slipper. So I'm ready to fasten off. You'll leave yourself a tail that's long enough to weave in. Pull that tail through the loop on your hook. And you want to make sure your join is at the back, or this is actually the underside of the slipper. Now when you have that in place, you'll just make sure everything is nice and tidy, and you'll grab 2 more of your stitch markers, or the 2 that you've been working with. And we're going to place these markers in the edge stitches. So I have this nice and flat. I'm going to find one edge and place my stitch marker there. And then find the other edge and place it there. To continue with the first round of the top part of our slipper, we're going to fasten on again. We want to lay our slipper so that the right side is facing us, and we're just going to be working along this top edge here. We'll create a slip knot. And I'm going to find this one of the markers. So the marker that is to the side where you're going to be crocheting in this direction. So I'm going to join where this marker is here. So I'm going to place my hook in the stitch so I don't lose it. Then place that loop on my hook, pull it through, and chain 1. From here, we're going to start off this new round by making a single crochet in the same stitch where we just fastened on. So again, that means we're not counting that chain 1 as a stitch. So we've made our first stitch here. We're going to make 1 single crochet into each of the next a certain number of stitches. So 18 for me, for the size I'm working on. You're going to find your number in the written instructions. And we should be working along the top side of our slipper. Then once you've worked that specific number of stitches, you should come right up to your stitch marker. If you don't, if you're one off on either direction, it really doesn't matter. Those stitch markers were really just to give us a starting point and nothing else. So we just needed to know where to fasten on, but we had to fasten on to the side in relation of the join on the bottom, since it is a little bit visible. So once you have that specific number of stitches worked, now we're going to create a long chain. And the long chain is going to serve as the foundation for our heel. Well, sort of. It's really going to be the opening for where the heel will be worked later on. And this will make a little bit more sense once you see it come together. The number of chains that you're creating is going to be determined by your size, so you'll refer to your written instructions here. I'm going to chain 21. Now before you jump in and start making all kinds of chains, there's a very important piece of information in the pattern that says to chain loosely. We're going to be working back into these chains on the next round, and we don't want them to be tight. So typically what I'll do is work my chain as normal, but I'll sort of pull up a little bit on my hook to exaggerate and make them a little more loose than I normally would. Once you have your nice long chain for your heel opening, we're going to skip a bunch of stitches. So you can place your hook down if you find that that'll be easier. We're going to skip a total number of stitches. Again, that's going to be determined by the size, so refer to your pattern here. I'm going to skip 19 stitches. So I'm not counting the stitch where my last single crochet was. I'm going to start counting to the next one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you get to your join, just go ahead and count that as a stitch right where it's slip stitched together. So that's going to be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And perfect. That happened perfectly. We want to make our last single crochet here. It should be right up next to the first stitch of this round. If that's not the case for you, just go back and double check your counts. Okay, so I've verified that. Now I'm ready to join everything on. I want to make sure I don't twist this chain. So situate it so that you're looking at the top of the chain so you can see the braid. And then you'll locate that last stitch that's right next to the first and insert your hook into that stitch and just single crochet like you normally would. It's going to feel a little funny because we have this floppy chain on the other end. But you can secure it with your hands, single crochet, and the last order of business is to join with a slip stitch to that first stitch. So moving on to our next round here, what we need to do is finish up this little foundation that we started in the previous row. So we're going to chain 1 and single crochet in the same stitch. And we're going to make 1 single crochet into every stitch until we get to that chain. So this number will be the same as it was from the previous row. So if you remember, I made 18 single crochets for my size. Well, that's going to be the same here. And once you make it to that chain, you want to make sure that you don't forget that last single crochet there. If you're counting along, you won't have any issues there. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is make 1 single crochet into each one of our chains. So recall back to the number of chains that you made. So I made 21 for my size. That's the number of stitches that you need to have. So you can count as you go. It'll make sure you're on the right track. And we're going to single crochet into each one of the chains. The specific place where you make your stitch doesn't really matter as much as the consistency is. I personally find that it's so much easier to work my stitches under 1 loop of the chain. Now, a lot of people like to do 2 because that can cut down on some of the gaps that might be in place. And some people like to work under the bump, and typically I do. But for this pattern, I find it a little bit easier to work under just that first loop right here. Again, you can do whatever you prefer. Once you've finished single crocheting into each one of your chains, you should be at the end of your row. We'll go ahead and single crochet in that last stitch there. And then join with a slip stitch to your first single crochet. So we're moving on once again to a repeated section in our pattern. We're going to repeat the round that I'm demonstrating here until our work measures a certain length again. So let's talk about the repeat first, and then we'll talk about how much you need to repeat it. We're going to chain 1 to start off the round, single crochet in the same stitch as your chain, so from your starting point there. And are you ready for this repeat? It's really simple. We're just going to make 1 single crochet into every stitch. That's going to include the stitches from our chain right here, but they're stitches now because we worked into that before. So this part should be super simple for you. So when you make it to the end of your round, just make sure you don't forget that last stitch there. I'm going to single crochet, and then I'll join with a slip stitch to the first stitch. So nothing new there, same techniques. What I need for you to do at this point is repeat that last round, the one we just covered, until your work measures the length that's described in your pattern. So for me, I'm going to work until it measures 3 inches from this starting point here. So I find it easier just to measure from the heel, but you can of course measure from wherever. At the very beginning here, this new section that we added on, we want it to be the measurement that's listed in the pattern. So once you finish that, we'll come back to the tutorial and we'll look at the next steps. So here we are at the end of that repeat where we just covered, and our slipper looks like this now. We are really getting to the point where we're almost finished. We just have the cuff to work and of course the heel. So we're going to work 2 rounds next. That's going to incorporate a little bit of decreasing. So we're going to begin this next round with a chain 1, and we're pretty conditioned and used to working in that same stitch as a slip stitch, but we're not going to do that this round. The first thing we're going to do is decrease. So we're going to single crochet 2 together over the first 2 stitches. So again, I'm not working into the place where my slip stitch was and where my chain is coming from. I'm going to go over to the next stitch. So this is the first stitch of the round, yarn over, pull up a loop, and we'll leave those 2 loops there because we're going to single crochet 2 together. Just insert your hook into the next stitch, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Now you have 3 loops on your hook. You can yarn over and pull through all 3 of those loops. So now we've just turned those 2 stitches into 1. The next thing we're going to do is single crochet once into a certain number of stitches, and again that's size dependent. So I am going to work 1 single crochet into each of the next 15 stitches for the size that I'm working on. You can find your specific number on the written instructions. Then once you've completed that, we're going to do 2 decreases right next to each other. So we're going to single crochet 2 together twice. So we have those 2 decreases there, and the next thing we're going to do is work 1 single crochet into each of the next, 17 stitches for me for the ladies size 7 and 8. Again, you're going to find that number on your written instructions for the size that you're making. Now you can see why I recommended at the beginning of the tutorial, it's always a great idea to print that pattern and circle the numbers for the size that you're making because there are so many references to it for this particular pattern. And once you made it to the end of your round, after you worked that long section, you should have 2 stitches remaining. We're going to work a single crochet 2 together over those last 2 stitches. And to finish off the round, we're going to locate our first single crochet, which was actually that single crochet 2 together. We're going to join with a slip stitch to that stitch. Now we're moving on to the last round before we're going to start working on the cuff, and this one has worked very similarly to the previous round. So we're going to begin by chaining 1, and we're going to start off with a single crochet 2 together. And again, we're not going to include the stitch where our chain is coming from, so where our slip stitch is. We're going to start off in the next stitch. So the first stitch of the round, and you'll single crochet 2 together. And then we're going to single crochet into a set of stitches. Again, that's found on your written instructions. I'll be working into the next 13. Just a single crochet into each of the next 13 stitches. So the sequence of this round is basically the same as the previous round. The only difference being we are using a different number of stitches in these long sections. After that, we're going to single crochet 2 together twice. So we're going to decrease twice here. Now we're going to wrap up the round with 1 single crochet into each of the next 15 for this particular size. And the last thing we'll do for this round is single crochet 2 together over those last 2 stitches. And we'll join with a slip stitch to the first stitch of this round. Now we're moving on to the first round of the cuff. What we want to do to start this round is chain 1, and we're going to go back to working in that same stitch as our slip stitch. So we're going to start off with a single crochet into that stitch. And we'll start our repeat, which is really simple. We're going to chain 1, skip 1 stitch, and single crochet into the next. That repeat again is chain 1, skip 1, single crochet into the next. And we're going to repeat that all the way around. Once you've made it to the end of this round, we're going to maintain our pattern here. So we want to chain 1, we'll skip the last stitch, and then we'll join with a slip stitch to our first single crochet. Now moving on to round 2 of the cuff, we're going to get a little bit creative here. So we're going to start things off with a chain 1, and we're going to half double crochet in the same stitch that our chain 1 is coming from. So half double crochet, we'll wrap the yarn, pull up a loop, and then now for every skipped single crochet from that previous round, we're going to double crochet in that space. And this is where we're going to get a little bit creative. We have to work around the chain 1, but we're going to go into the stitch that we skipped. So here's what we'll do. We'll wrap the yarn because we're going to work with a double crochet, and find your skipped single crochet. You can see the V right there underneath the chain, and just insert your hook into that V and just completely ignore the fact that you have a chain sitting on top of it, and work your double crochet like normal. Now when you yarn over and pull up that first loop, you'll want to make sure you have some looseness here in your yarn. So you want to make sure you pull up and get your tension squared away before you finish off your double crochet, because if you don't, you'll sort of have a jagged appearance and that'll just look a little bit messy. So after we've made that double crochet in the skipped single crochet from the round below, we're going to half double crochet in the single crochet that's next. And that's our repeat. So we're coming up to a chain 1 space. That's how we know we're going to work our double crochet and the skipped single crochet. And then half double crochet and the single crochet that's next. So that next stitch. Double crochet in your skipped stitch. Half double crochet in the next stitch. All right, so that's our repeat for this round. Now once you've made it to the end of your round, you'll still maintain your pattern. So I have my half double crochet in my last single crochet of the round, and I don't want to ignore this skipped stitch. So I'm going to double crochet into that skipped single crochet from the previous round, and then we'll join with a slip stitch to your first half double crochet. Okay, so now we've come to a point where we're going to repeat a little bit more. We're almost finished with the cuff. We're going to start the next round with a chain 1, and we're going to half double crochet in the same stitch as our slip stitch. And now we're going to work in a ribbing. So we're going to do that with front post double crochets, and the next stitch we have available is that double crochet where we worked in that previous round. So what we're going to do is insert our hook in the side of that stitch. So I have my half double crochet here, my double crochet there. I'm going to go into just the space in between, and then I want to pop the hook back out through the other side. So I have the post now in front of my hook, and it's being pulled out, and that's where I'm going to finish my double crochet as normal. So this is our front post double crochet. This stitch is really cool. It creates a lot of great texture, as you can see here, and it's used a lot of times for ribbing. Okay, so once we have that front post double crochet, we're going to find our next stitch, which is that half double crochet, and we're going to half double crochet there. And that's the repeat. We're going to locate our next double crochet. We're going to front post double crochet there. And half double crochet into the next half double crochet. So go ahead and repeat that around. We'll cover real quick just what to do at the end of the round, and then I'll let you know about the repeat and how often you need to repeat this round. When you've made it to the end of your round, you'll make sure you don't forget that last double crochet. So you'll front post double crochet there and join with the slip stitch to your first half double crochet. And what we need to do is work that last row until our cuff measures a certain length. Now, for those of you who are working on the smaller sizes, the child size, the size that the cuff needs to be is 1 inch. So we're already about there. You probably won't even need to go on. But for those of us who are working on the adult sizes, we'll need to repeat that last round, maybe 1 or 2 more times, just so your cuff measures the size that's listed on your written instructions. So for my size, it's 1.5 inches. And like I said, we're just about at 1 inch here. So I'm going to add on another round, and then we'll wrap up the cuff and start working on the heel. So after you've finished working your cuff and it measures the proper length, you can go ahead and fasten off, and we're going to dive right into the heel. So you want to orient your slipper so that you have the cuff part facing towards you. And we're going to count over a certain number of chains. So this was the chain that we created when we added on this new section. And basically we want to start in the middle. So it depends on the size that you're working. For me, I'm working on that ladies 7 to 8. So I counted over 11 chains, and I just put a stitch marker there to let me know that that's where I need to fasten on for the first round of the heel. So we'll fasten on with a slip stitch just like before. Go ahead and leave yourself a tail that's decently long. You'll chain 1 to secure the new yarn, and we're going to single crochet in the same space. Now what we're going to do from here is single crochet into the chain, so in the bottom of the chain. That's how it's written in the written instructions, and the number is dependent on the size. So I'm going to work a single crochet into each of the next 8 chains. And if you're having problems seeing where the chain is, just look for the single crochet stitch. So they're going to be upside down from this orientation. So you'll just look for that upside down single crochet, and that's how you know where to work that stitch. Now, if you recall from before when we were working into this chain, I was just working in the 1 loop. So if you did the same thing, when you work in this chain, you want to make sure that you catch both of those remaining 2 loops of the chain. That's going to make sure you cut back on the holes that you're going to have, and your heel is going to be a lot more secure that way. Then once you have the correct number of single crochets in that chain, we're going to start working over these stitches now. You can find the exact number on the written instructions. I'm going to work 1 single crochet into the next 19 stitches, and that's basically going to get you from one corner to the next. When you get to your join here, you'll just treat it as a stitch and work your single crochet just where the slip stitch is. That's probably the easiest way for you to know exactly where to work your stitch. And I'm going to continue working over this tail. It's going to help me make sure that it's secure, and I'll have a smaller tail to weave in at the end. And then once you've worked along that edge, then we'll just rotate our work again. We're going to start working in those chains, and you'll just work 1 single crochet into each remaining chain, and you'll want to double check that number with the written instructions. I will have 10 chains remaining, and that's going to get me to the end of the round. Once you finish that and you're at the end of your round, you'll go ahead and join with the slip stitch to your first single crochet. Moving on to round number 2 of the heel, we're going to chain 1 to start off the round and single crochet in the same space. And I'm going to make 1 single crochet into each of the next 7 stitches. Now you'll get your specific number based on the size you're creating, so this is where you'll find a difference. Once you finish that, you'll be in the next corner, and you should end up in the same situation as before. You'll have 1 stitch from the bottom, and you'll single crochet that with the next stitch or the first stitch of the upper part. And single crochet in the next stitch. And place a marker there. And then single crochet into each remaining stitch. When you've made it to the end of your round, you'll join with a slip stitch to your first single crochet. Round 3 of the heel is really simple. We're going to start by chaining 1 and single crochet in the same stitch as your slip stitch. And we're going to make 1 single crochet into every stitch all the way around. The only thing you need to keep in mind here is that we need to keep those stitch markers in place. That's going to mark where we're going to decrease moving forward. So we want to make sure we leave those there. So when you get to that stitch with the stitch marker, you can just remove it, single crochet in that stitch, and replace it. And just keep going. When you've made it to the end of round 3, you'll join with a slip stitch to your first single crochet. And we're ready now for round 4 of the heel. We're going to do some more decreasing. So we'll start off with a chain 1 and single crochet into the first stitch, so right where your chain 1 was coming from. And we're going to single crochet until we get to 2 stitches before the marker. So we're going to leave this stitch and this stitch open. So we just want to single crochet to that point. Now we're going to single crochet 2 together over those 2 stitches that we have before our marker. Okay, and we want to remove our stitch marker for just a minute. We'll single crochet into that stitch where the marker was. Put the marker back. And then we're going to single crochet 2 together over the next 2 stitches. And that's our repeat. We're going to make 1 single crochet into every stitch around the foot. When we get to 2 before that next marker, we're going to single crochet 2 together over those. We'll single crochet where our marker is. We'll single crochet 2 together, and then we'll just finish off the round with 1 single crochet into every stitch. So go ahead and get that finished, and we'll meet back up at the end of this round. So I've now made it to the end of round 4 of the heel, and we have a small repeat. We're going to repeat the last 2 rounds once more. So we're going to repeat round 3, which was where we made 1 single crochet into every stitch. We kept our markers in place, and then we're going to repeat round 4 after that, which is where we did a decrease. So just like we covered in the previous section. Go ahead and finish up that repeat, and we'll move on to the next section. So what I've done off camera is I've repeated those last 2 rounds, and we're coming up to another repeated section. The next round is given in the written instructions, but it's really the same as round 4. That's where we're going to chain 1, single crochet in the same stitch. We're going to single crochet to 2 until our marker, then we'll single crochet 2 together there. We'll single crochet in our marked stitch, single crochet 2 together over the next. We're going to repeat that around. So everything you learned back in round 4, we're going to apply here. So you'll repeat this last round, a total number that's given to you in the written instructions. For me, I'm going to repeat it 4 times, so I'll have a remainder of 8 stitches at the end of all 4 of those rounds. Now that's going to be the case for all of the sizes except the smallest size. You'll end up with 4 stitches remaining. So I'll go ahead and finish that up. We'll meet back up. All we'll have to do is sew up the heel and add the ears and the face. So once you've finished up that repeat of your heel, then you'll need to fasten off, and you'll leave a tail that's a couple feet long. We're going to use this to tie up the heel, and you'll turn your slipper inside out, which I've already done off camera. And you'll need your tapestry needle for this step. And we just want to align it so that the stitches are side by side. And we're just going to seam this together. And I like to use a whip stitch. It works pretty well. It'll give you a nice sturdy closure. So once we finish that assembly, we turn our sock right side out. It looks like this. So we're just about finished. We have just 2 small things left to complete. We're going to work on the ears now. So we're going to grab some yarn, create a slip knot, and chain 4. Then we'll join with a slip stitch to that first chain. That's going to create a ring. And then we'll just open that ring up so we can work our stitches in the middle of the ring. So we're going to chain 1, and then we'll single crochet in the center of the ring. Then we'll half double crochet in the center of the ring. And then we're going to make 8 double crochets in the center. Then we'll half double crochet and single crochet in the center of the ring. Now go ahead and shift your stitches over, sort of scrunch them up as much as you can. Then we can fasten off, and you'll leave yourself a tail that's long enough to sew the ear into place. And you're just going to do that one more time. We need to have 2 ears. When you're ready to sew the ears in place, you'll just use your heel as a guide. And flip up the top part. We're going to sew them to the base of the cuff. You'll just thread your tail on your darning needle and just sort of eyeball it. I like to place it so that it's just right up next to the edge of where the fold is. And stitch it in place. I would recommend going over this a couple of times. You do want this to be as secure as possible so it doesn't fall off later. Then once you have it nice and secure, you can just go ahead and weave in this end along the back side of your work. The last thing we need to do is embroider the face, and I find it easy if we mark the stitch for our eyes. I'm going to do those last. So all I did was go straight down from the center of the ear, pick a row that's just a couple inches below that, and mark a stitch. And I did the same thing on the other side, being sure I'm on the same row so they'll be even. And I'm going to tackle the nose and the mouth first. So I have some black yarn or some dark colored yarn works, whatever you have on hand, and double it up on your darning needle. We're going to start off going directly in between where the eyes are, and we're going to go a little bit down from there. So we're going to go in and back out a stitch that's diagonal from that. And you can really just eyeball all of this. And you want to leave yourself a tail that's a little bit long because of course we don't want this sticking out. So we're going to weave that in once we're finished. We'll go into the same stitch and back out of the same stitch. Then we'll go into the same point at the bottom. We'll go back out right next to where it was. So we're just going to use this to create a little triangle for the nose, always using the same center point. Once you're on your last side, you can go ahead and cut the yarn from your darning needle. Then we're going to thread the two that we had left over. And I'm just going to fill up this little gap that I have here. And stay on the inside. So I'll pull that through. And the last step is to create the mouth. So we're going to go down and up, just like this. I'm going to go ahead and use this long tail that's already there. So before I do that, and this will be a little hard for you to see on camera, but I have these two groups of two strands. So the one that I had for the tail and then the one that I cut, I'm just going to tie a knot with these, just so I have that secure. Then I'll thread the long tails to make the mouth. The last thing we have to do is to make the eyes, and I have some tail left over, so I'm just going to use the same piece. If you don't, then just go ahead and add on a new piece. And before I remove the stitch marker, I'm just going to go in underneath the stitch that I have marked, and then you can remove that marker. Pull that through and then go back into the top of the stitch. And if you can work your needle around, you can just come right back out. It's a little bit easier. You don't have to stick your hands inside for that. And you'll do that just a few times. So once you have that first one, again, if your tail is long enough here, you can just go down into the top and pull it through so that your yarn is now set on the inside, and just rotate it around, and you can just jump right over to the other eye. I have this worked into the stitch below the marker.
And pull that out and just repeat.
Once you've got it to the same size, you'll just work your yarn in through the inside. And now you can just weave in your ends on the inside here.